Well, on the one hand, some environmental problems are brilliantly addressed with a tiny shift in policy, right? And this is something that religious ecologists need to remember. For example, in Dominican Republic, which shares an island with Haiti, right? Haitians have a deeply sacred relationship to some trees, right? They literally embody the some of the deities of the Afro-Catholic, Afro-Caribbean pantheon, right? And yet the combination of mismanagement, corruption, and necessity and population have contributed to pretty widespread desertification and deforestation in Haiti. What did the Dominican Republic do? I mean, they're officially, like, the government is officially Catholic, right? It's a Catholic culture country. And yet all they did was subsidize natural gas, and it drastically reduced the amount of deforestation in the country. Of course, in addition to setting aside a quarter of the country as national park, and at least on paper, implementing some strict penalties for cutting down trees, right? So those are all policy, and they worked, right? You look at the Google map, and it's pretty obvious that there's a real political ecology happening across that invisible line. And so that's such an important case study for me to remember, right? Sometimes it is policy, sometimes it is bureaucratic, and it's boring, and we just got to do stuff like that. But on the other hand, right, if you find yourself in a conservation NGO and they're trying to lecture poor people about, the how bad their hunting or gathering or subsistence practices or small scale farming or swidden systems are, right? You're probably not going to be very successful. You're completely missing the point in the picture around how people see themselves in relation to their places. And that's a religious conversation, right? You're coming at them with a religion of binaries that says people bad, nature good. Could you do us a favor and get out of our church? And they're like, excuse me, this is our traditional territory. And, so there's been all kinds of arguments in conservation circles about the term conservation refugees, right? For the good of a species or an ecosystem, some conservation organizations, they're probably getting better at this, but have contributed to kicking indigenous and rural peoples off their land for what they see as a greater good, right? And that's a religious conversation, right? And so we really need to enlist the knowledge and the wisdom of local peoples, but also the the conservation organizations need to understand culture and religious framings of the world, to rethink their strategies or find ways to do conservation of species, essential work, within the paradigms of the peoples that live and should have sovereignty over these places, right? And I find that sometimes conservationists are these days they can be very decentrist when it comes to non-North American context. Like, okay, well, let's just let indigenous people manage. They're much better conservationists, the people on the land. But in the US, they're staunch socialists, right? The state, let's make sure the state keeps it. Let's make it a designated wilderness. We don't trust Utahns to manage their land, because as soon as we let Utahns manage their land, they're going to exploit it for oil and gas, right? So I find that a very interesting contradiction in conversation. And land in Utah is also a religious issue, in the West, right? The Bundys, for example, occupying the Muller Wildlife Refuge. Not only is that a racial issue, right? Like if people of color had done that, there would have been a lot more murder. But because white men did it, you know. I think one man was killed though, but I think he like fully opened fire on police or something. Of course, the point being that they had more sympathy and and then Mr. Bundy ran for governor of Idaho recently, right? So that's a religious issue, right? Because he's a staunch Mormon who really is advocating for a more libertarian approach to federal, state, and even local government. And that's not a left and right issue. I find a lot of those issues to be blurring the boundary because they're kind of decentrist. They love the land. They see themselves as stewards, right? They don't want development to eat up ranches and farmland, you know. So some really interesting conversations happening, and those are interfaith dialogues, right? Between a Forest Service worker and a rancher. That's an interfaith dialogue, you know? Those are two very different ways of viewing the world. So we need more of that. And then the power of institutional religion is the communal um, networking, right? If we can enlist our tradition in the momentum for a campaign or something, then that can be really good, right? And so there's lots of ways for traditions to get involved in local issues or to build bridges with other communities, right? I mean, Muslim-Jewish dialogue is always important, but even more so now, and local and land issues and environmental issues can be a bridge for those sorts of things. So yeah, the list goes on, but those are a couple of ways.